When you think about the biotech process from ideation to commercialization, from I'm going to do an approach where I'm just going to do a wide screen and narrow down, and I've got to make sure that, my assays are relevant to find the right molecule to the, significant risk in going from pilot to 300,000 gallons. What do you think are the riskiest areas? And don't say all, because yes, they all.
All of them. Every single one.
Welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. Today on the show, we have Dr. David Breslauer. Biotech is having a beauty moment. From lab-grown actives to mushroom-based packaging, the industry is buzzing with innovation. But how much of it is hype and how much is genuinely scalable science? David is the CTO, Chief Technology Officer at Bolt Threads, a biomaterials company known for turning scientific possibilities into tangible products. With a PhD in bioengineering from UC Berkeley and UCSF, David has spent the last decade building a company at the forefront of synthetic biology, most notably lab-grown spider silk for consumer applications in beauty, fashion, and beyond. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
Yeah. Did I get that introduction right for you?
Yes, it's beautiful.
It's amazing what you can find on the internet. So I'm really excited to be talking about biotech because, again, you and I are not new to biotech, but the beauty industry is certainly really getting pretty buzzy about it. So, would love to hear from you how you think about biotech in the context of beauty and how that may be different than from how it's being marketed.
Yeah, that's a great question because I come at this as you have as well. It's trained in biotech, and we tend to have definitions for terms that are relatively specific. They can evolve a little over time, but the ones that get popularized or get traction amongst the consumers, then often get bloated in terms of what they mean in the commercial market space. Whether or not we still means that in the scientific landscape. So for me, my working definition is really engineering living systems. Now that could be microbes, plant cells, enzymes to manufacture molecules or materials that are unavailable or unaffordable from nature at industrial scale. But what is so important about what that is also what it isn't. And I see that a lot in the space now. Standard plant extracts getting rebranded as biotech, ingredients that are merely purified from a crop, cold pressed botanicals, getting labeled biotechs in ads. All of those are great things and they're great ingredients, but they're not biotech by any traditional definition.
Yeah. And what do you think is a reason why, this is starting to become such a buzzword in the industry? Obviously, again, we've been doing it and we are intimately involved in and have the knowledge on, why this is such a benefit and what it could unlock. But, what do you think has been the hesitation with the industry as a whole in, kind of really being a little bit safer and not, broadly adopting it, especially when it was big in the food movement, right? When you had a lot of these meatless burgers, why now? What is the timing and atmosphere that's really come together to create, the biotech buzz?
Yeah, I think biotech, what's so capturing about it and what's particular to the beauty industry is the way in which ingredients can trickle from the medical space down into the beauty industry over time. When I was in high school, retinols were prescription for acne, and now you buy them over the counter. So there is an understanding that, or an experience, I should say, in the industry that these technologies that were once medical, like biotech, which was for insulin, is how it started for diabetics, can translate down. But really, for the average consumer, I think that it combines science, sustainability, futurism, all into one beautiful package to as a new buzzword. And so marketers want to apply it to everything.
Yeah. And diving into that a little deeper, people that are using maybe biotech ingredients that just see that ingredient and say, "Oh, it's biotech, and I'm going to use it." Let's demystify this a little bit and unveil, peek behind the curtain. You know, from your perspective, especially given your tenure with the Bolt Threads, what does it take really? I know we could spend hours talking about this, but broadly and summarizing it, what does it take to go from scientific proof of concept or an idea to a market ready ingredient?
Yeah, it is. It is not as simple as anyone would like, nor anyone really believes.
Yeah,
It used to take 10 times longer. So we've made a lot of progress in the field of biotech, and that's a whole separate podcast. But still, to this day, depending on what you want to make, you have to do the lab scale R&D, and that can take years just to develop the molecule and cost millions of dollars, tons of people hours, let alone prove the efficacy of the molecule. If you're actually going for efficacy and not just story, then
yeah,
that costs a whole nother layer, and you have to do clinical trials, then scale up to pilot scale, demo runs, manufacturing runs,
yeah,
downstream purification, quality, even just global regulatory takes 3 years on its own. So, we're talking anywhere from 5 to 10 years, 10 to $150 million before break even volumes if you're doing a mass ingredient. This isn't trivial by any stretch of the imagination. There are things one can do to make small scale, expensive ingredients that you can launch direct to consumer. And
sure,
people do that all the time, and they use that extra margin of being a direct consumer brand
yeah,
to cover the costs of the ingredient. But then your game is basically brand building. It's not ingredient innovation or manufacture. And the ingredient is only going to be as accessible as that one brand is willing to pay for it.
yeah. I think there's been some pessimists, I'll refer to them, saying that there hasn't been a lot of innovation in this industry. And I always go back to this experience in biotech, right, where what you just described, right, this multi-year timeline and millions of dollars, 10 to 15 million dollars, right, just to go from, hey, I have an idea for an SPF replacement, to now I've got a powder in hand. And the reality is that these have to compete with these commodity ingredients, right? That have, maybe some relatively simple chemical synthesis process, easy inputs, and, a lot of experience or precedent for how they will scale. How do you see biotech fitting into that competitive landscape, and how we can break through to, be competitive with chemically synthesized ingredients without just it being marketing, right? Like, oh, well, it's cool and buzzy versus this is actually game changing.
Yeah, fantastic question. And one win we have with biotech is, for the most part, it's inherently sustainable. Yeah, there are aspects you can argue with, whether you're looking at biodegradability or bio-based, depending on how it's done. But broadly, you're talking about non-petrochemical, non-extractive processes. So you have that win. But one clear thing from my experience is that's not enough. It gets you interest, but then you have to work on performance. And sometimes I feel that we as scientists, people trained as scientists, we think so hard about performance from a technical perspective when we really need to shift our mindset to what is performance from a product perspective. And from a product perspective, that's really what is the value you're providing to your customer. And that can be as much as something that's, performing for the consumer, to something that just helps the brand save money. And sometimes we tend to focus on the hard, novel problems because we're technologists and innovators at heart, only to find that, it doesn't really help anybody, or nobody's interested in paying the cost for it. And what would really solve the problem is something much simpler. And so I think there's, a bit of a shift in thinking that needs to happen in terms of not just, what is the excitement and story about my biotech ingredient? What is the problem it's solving that people really want to, in a way that people want to pay for? And that includes, switching costs. Brands are loath to switch things in their supply chain. So just being better, it has to be a lot better. It has to be 10,000x better for a brand, for a big brand to switch. And I don't say that number hyperbolically.
No.
That is, the kind of change you have to have for someone to say, we're going to switch over a global commodity supply chain to use your ingredient or to fit in your ingredient.
Yeah. And then how do you mitigate risks such as being the only supplier of this, right? The hesitancy to say, well, I will switch over my global supply chain, but I'm betting on this company big, right?
My experience has aligned with, even though I had read it and I hadn't experienced it, and now I respect it so much, with the book Crossing the Chasm, and the whole idea that to build up a robust ingredient supply business, you want to be in with the big brands, people buying, 10,000 tons per year. But to get there, to get through the regulatory filings, the supply chain diversity, the costs, you really need people who are willing to be first movers, take a little more risk. And that's where I have really loved the independent beauty brands, and find them so essential in terms of figuring out who you can partner with, who understand they may be paying a little more, but they're going to get to launch first. That, maybe their quality controls aren't as stringent. Maybe they get to do something novel that the big brands don't, because they have harsher restrictions. And so figuring out who can be your first mover while keeping your eye on the prize of, and how does that transition me into the big CPGs? Because you've got to make back all the costs of that R&D. If you've developed a molecule for next to nothing, great. You can sell it to independent brands all you want, but at some point, you're going to have to make up all that biotech lab R&D costs.
Yeah, for sure. And touching upon regulatory, and I think there's two parts to the question, and the first part in terms of regulatory, you talked about really the differentiator of performance, and so I see biotech really being able to open the doors to having more potent compounds or more pure molecules, obviously ethically sourced, but there is also that fine line, right, where when you have a molecule that is so potent or great and you want to talk about it, you often go into those structure function claims, right? That then the FDA says, no, that's a drug. So how do you navigate really having this compelling evidence that brands can't maybe necessarily use in the way that you've translated it? And what support, do you think you're being, an ingredient supplier in the biotech space, you're part of the roles that you've created within the organization really are this need to help brands to translate this technical data, this structure function bordering on drug claims into usable consumer-centric language.
Yeah, that's something everybody has to be very cautious about, particularly in biotech, where I was talking before about ingredients that flow down, that trickle down from the medical space into the broader market. What is the claim that is, that's not going to get you in trouble? What is the claim that's valuable, but is not going to get your, wrist slapped or, really put you on a blacklist by the FDA? And it's hard to navigate, I think, because biotech, with the ingredients it's capable of making, are very close to can make things that are medical in nature. So unless you want to go down that route, where at this point you're making a medical device company or a medical ingredient, my recommendation and my experience has, do some amount of the work. Do not make the claim. Let the big brands, the big CPGs, the people with the resources, the legal clout, the understanding of the FDA, then give them the guide to say, you can do the tests. You can help us do that filing. You can make the claims. Unless if you're starting up this business and you want to be in medical devices, go for it. I'm happy for you. Just know what you're getting into. And again, because as you said, biotech lives, you could push it either direction real well. After all the money you spent on just lab R&D, the amount of money you're going to spend on FDA regulatory for medical claims is a whole nother world. So how can you partner with a company who's willing to, bring in that expertise and take on that cost?
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. You know, things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucapse line by going to tagra.com/Cellucapse. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
And the second part to the question, that I think I encountered when trying to launch a new ingredient, that I believe that the botanical space maybe is seeing a little bit more of, and there's a lot more scrutiny, is launching a new ingredient, right, in the US. So the EU is pretty prescriptive in terms of the testing that needs to be done. But as an example, ferments, right? So you basically ferment something, you take all of that is, excreted, and that's your product. A lot of times those can be very complex mixtures of, thousands to tens of thousands of different compounds. Being able to elucidate what is in it and how much of it has been very complex and is some definitely some a Sisyphusian, task, right? But, in terms of like walking that line of safety, right? What are some of the areas of like very much ambiguity that you encountered in developing a new ingredient that, it became more of like, well, is this I want to know because of science? Is this a, principle of safety, or is this actually mandated by the FDA? Because I have seen companies take varying levels of risk when it comes to these areas that are maybe not well defined.
Yeah, I think as a biotech scientist, and I see this in your response too, you want to know everything. To some extent, you have to, and you want to know mechanisms of action, what is going on in your mixture. To some extent, you have to remember that people, used to put arbitrary extracts on their face with no seasonal quality control, this and that. There was a lot of variability. So as much as we have the tools to understand, that doesn't mean it's beneficial. It's intellectually beneficial. It helps for the next development. But I mean, the utmost priority is always safety. So knowing what you're making, and particularly if you're doing something like a ferment, where it has a mixture that's going to be almost impossible to fully characterize, or extremely costly, I should say, and to break apart and this and that. Just knowing by your key metrics that you're making the same thing each time, so you're not there, and so you're not adding a surprise in one batch that might have a safety issue. So really, it's about manufacturing consistency and quality, and then safety tests for the bulk ingredient. If you find that your ingredient, or your mixture, I should say, because this is in the context of ferments where you have a complicated mixture. If you're finding if your mixture is causing great benefits, but is also causing occasional safety concerns, well, then you have to decide if it's worth it to try to figure out if you can separate those two things out. But, I think I've also been surprised. I need to take off how much I need to take off my science hat often and be like, I'm the only one, or my team's the only one who's interested in all these details. Did it really actually add any benefit to the story? I mean, the person on the other side is often not a scientist. They're expecting us to be the scientists, but you're never going to be able to explain to them every single thing and educate them on your entire PhD on fermentation. And so recognizing that and saying, what do I need to know here? What's worth knowing? What's helpful to knowing? But understanding that the priority is knowing is safety.
I sometimes refer to it as the like fuck around and find out, right? Where you have to be prepared to make decisions based on the information that you will obtain that may or may not be positive, right?
Yeah,
and so there's
absolutely.
Always that kind of like, you need to plan ahead for if, you decide you want to elucidate the composition of this and you've got a high endotoxin load, like what next, like
it's not. We're not the first people doing this. If you go through the safety literature in whether it's personal care or food, you find cases, so and so put a, hydrolyzed rice protein, and now they're studying it because there are occasional reports of a reaction. And it's like, why would anyone have suspected that? But, the safety industry, the toxicology groups learn more. And that's how they get some of their safety markers. Again, that doesn't mean go willy-nilly. That's why we have patch tests and things like that. We have safety screens on average and expected adverse reaction rates so that you can do things in a pretty reasonably appropriate, responsible way. Now, of course, going back to your earlier point, the medical requirements are much more stringent for a medical device.
When you think about the, biotech process from ideation to commercialization, what do you think the riskiest areas are in that? From I'm going to do an approach where I'm just going to do a wide screen and narrow down, and I've got to make sure that my assays are relevant to find the right molecule, to the significant risk in going from pilot to 300,000 gallons. What do you think are the riskiest areas? And don't say all, because yes, they
all of them, every single one.
Let's rank them. What is the highest? Where have you learned the most, let's say?
That's a good question. I think for as challenging as the scientific discovery is, meaning, how do we find something that does the thing we want to do? That's, of course, incredibly risky and hard to do. But I don't know if it's the riskiest, but there is a compounded risk once you find that. I think there are so many opportunities to find functional molecules that I'll call the risk low because there's so much opportunity. Getting that to a point that it's cost effective and routine manufacturing as an ingredient is the highest risk. That execution, the number of things I see die on the vine, that doesn't mean that people haven't made something interesting out of it, published something interesting, maybe even sold the IP. But the number of things I see that don't reach consumers in any meaningful way because just trying to figure out how to scale up, stuck in non-scalable systems that they used for discovery that don't translate, could never get investment to do regulatory, or to either because they couldn't prove it out well enough, or couldn't get investment to prove it out well enough, or just get manufacturing to scale, or even if they do get manufacturing repeatedly, getting the cost down. The number of things I see there either just don't get to that point or die a slow death. Technology is tremendous. And so I think that's amongst the biggest risks is you have something, but how do you get it out there? And how do you get the money and go through the process? Because there's a million points where you can fail on the way. And when it comes to getting into the market, there's a huge amount of luck. Like, I didn't get into biotech because the personal care market was hot for biotech or peptides because I happened to be doing biotech and polypeptides and working on maybe a personal care ingredient and trying to sell it in the market, and then it got hot. So I got very lucky there.
Yeah. And I guess maybe extrapolating on that a little more, what are some misconceptions that you are seeing both in terms of brands and investors, right? Because this is buzzy with brands, and it inevitably and has been pretty buzzy with investors, minus recent, administration changes to how we support biotech and medical applications. But, what are some of the misconceptions you see, or if you were fundraising, what investors come and have, and you have to kind of be like, for me, one was like timeline, right? Like, this is not a 3-year investment.
There's an overlap in terms of what I see. And with brands, one of the biggest misconceptions is that a novel, new, and it can be the highest performing molecule out there, it can do everything under the sun, is still only going to be as expensive as their highest price commodity ingredient. The idea that, no, this is going to be more expensive at the outset, and it's going to require either you to pay that cost or some sort of arrangement or deal to make this work. I still get the expectation of people coming in and going, well, this is new, it's great, I want it, I want exclusive access to it. It only costs a couple $100 a kilo, right? And you're like, well, synthetic peptides cost, $1,000, $5,000 a kilo. Well, I don't use synthetic peptides because they're so expensive. So why would and again, for the audience, I make polypeptides. So why would my polypeptide be cheaper? And they don't, it's just sort of a lack of education on what it takes for a new ingredient to reach cost effectiveness. It's based, I think, in many ways on an experience where they're used to talking to large scale global manufacturers for a new ingredient, which might not have that much innovation. Is just sort of like, okay, we reformulated this in a different way for this little perk, and so it's you can make this claim and it only costs about the same. And so that's where I see brands struggle. And then with investors, it's always in the risk of scale up and then the margins. Investors these days, they're looking for things that can be billion-dollar companies. It's very hard to tell the story of an ingredient that's going to be a billion-dollar company unless you're saying, I'm going to make a brand associated with it and I'm going to sell that brand to a big CPG. Now, my caution with that is, if you look at the number of brands that have been created that have done that and the number that have actually been sold, it's like, okay, Olaplex, K18, any,
Biossance, maybe.
Biossance, like, exactly. So it's like, it's not a high probability event. You have to be both a great R&D and great marketer. It's not easy to do. And that's not meant to tell people it's impossible. It's just this educating the investor on where the opportunity is and what you have done uniquely and thinking about what you've done uniquely to make it valuable. Or, there is nothing wrong with maybe finding smaller investors who have different investment mandates and being like, if I flesh out the IP and claims, I might just be able to sell the R&D itself for, the outcome might be a $5 million sale or $1 million IP sale. But the current venture capital community doesn't think like that. But I encourage people in the audience to be like, okay, how can I think about maybe not being an ingredient supplier, but building up the R&D package well enough so that is acquirable.
I was just going to ask, in developing, once you go through, the process of developing, a biotech ingredient, you really then have that experience and capability. And so how much of this, especially looking for investors maybe that are, thinking more long-term, is this more of a platform that you can develop? And where do you think new technologies can be integrated, right? You talked a little bit in the beginning about how far we've come in just a few years in terms of, speed to market, but capabilities. But, what are some of the tools that are emerging that you see that could be applied to help to, reduce the risks, create, more scalable from a profitability standpoint, ingredients to even, integrating into, kind of these processes that can be, copy and pasted into new actives?
In terms of the advancement of the industry, there are so many more services now that if you can raise the money, you can or you have the cash, you can pay to do strain development, and you need some upfront cash to do your R&D. Like, there's no way out of that. But places you can do for the scale up and strain development, whether it be ginkgo or others, and there's a lot of others coming down the pike. But if you design towards the idea, now I don't just mean design towards your molecule, but design your business thinking and business processing. I'm going to do outsourced production. I'm going to leave the scale up to the scale up people, and the strain engineering to strain engineering people. There are ways to really minimize your overhead and be a business that's requires a different size of investment. But for everybody designing an ingredient, R&D platforms are very hot. But I would think critically on what your goal is. Meaning, I see acquisitions of R&D platforms, a lot of like screening for longevity in skin. But none of those people are necessarily manufacturing an ingredient. They very much focused on, we're going to invent the ingredient, discover the ingredient, invent the ingredient, prove its efficacy, get IP around it. That is, in and of itself, a business or technology that a company's interested in acquiring that's very different than a group of people who would be interested in acquiring ingredient manufacturing. And I've sort of been on both sides of this. And I think that the thing I see often, and I'm guilty of making this mistake, is sort of accidentally becoming both. And then
Okay.
and then you're everything to no one, because the ingredient manufacturers are going, oh, I'd be interested in acquiring this ingredient, but like, I don't know, you have so much overhead on the R&D. Or the R&D people are like, wait, are you an ingredient manufacturing company? I'm not interested. And it's so what are you? Who are you? What are you trying to do? Where are you investing your money? Are you investing in your IP portfolio, or are you investing it in scale up? And thinking really critically when you're thinking about an R&D platform, so to speak, or whether you're insourcing or outsourcing services in terms of like, what is your goal? Do you want to prove an ingredient? Do you want to manufacture an ingredient? Do you want to be do you just want to sell the IP?
To play devil's advocate here, how much though do you benefit from having an integrated process? So, as an example, in the cosmetic landscape, a head-banging, frustrating thing I encountered recently was developing a product, in a silo, and then the client said, "Oh, and I want this fragrance that I've been developing for the past 3 months. Here, put it in."
Right.
It didn't work. It was a square, or a square peg in a circle. How do you think about when you have these, you're leveraging platforms that, may work either in tandem or, in parallel? How do you, ensure that you're not becoming, kind of both everything to everyone, but also that, you're taking into account that the people that are identifying this molecule may not be great at then, getting it, the strain engineering to get it to a volume that I need.
If one is running a business where you're saying, I'm outsourcing most things to the extent that I can, there is an expertise in that. Outsourcing those things does not mean I don't have to do anything and I just manage the calendar, because there's always going to be, I can reproduce it in my hands. Can they reproduce it in their hands?
Yeah,
Can the third site reproduce it in their hands? And managing that and being and understanding all the caveats, all the intricacies. What is quality control? What does multi-site quality control mean? That is an expertise in and of itself. Whereas, vertical integration is an expertise in and of itself. And then you start learning who are the people you should be working with. Maybe you need to be working with people, customers, that are, a little more collaborative from the get-go, or you change your style in terms of how to adapt so they don't drop something on you like, hey, I just want to throw this fragrance in. But again, it's a muscle you build up, just like anything. I would be loath to just diminish it to just project or program management.
Sure.
You're really making sure all those tools and spaces and people can function together. You're flying out to sites and visiting them. And outsourcing just means, you don't have the reoccurring overhead costs and employee management, performance management, and all that. But and you can do things as one-time projects, but it still requires a lot of committed effort. We do so much of it the industry, the personal care industry, the formulation, manufacturing. So they're great at it. We just need to take that lesson into biotech. So it's more of a lesson for us than it is for most of the people in the audience.
True. So, kind of looking to, have concluding remarks, but something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on it and to hear if you've observed a change. But something that we encountered in kind of doing that, like shopping it around to individuals, was this whole GMO thing. And while, there can be genetic modification of the host, right, to produce the ingredient, inevitably the ingredient does not contain genetically modified elements.
Right.
However, there has been some hesitancy and some, larger players who have this very, very, I guess, disciplined or broad sense of GMO and kind of what they think about it and what they accept. Have you noticed any, kind of change in the acceptability and the, I guess, risk aversion for brands to say like, okay, well, it doesn't contain genetic modified ingredient, but a genetic modified organism was used in the process. Have you started to see a little bit more willingness to use those types of ingredients?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even certifications now where that are basically from a GMO but not GMO, and that those are very helpful. I have found you have to continue to re-educate brands. Every step of the way, somebody ends up in a regulatory checkbox that's, is this a GMO? And you have to remind them.
Yeah.
There's only a couple large CPGs that still are figuring out what they want to do, because they've basically said no to anything GMO. But particularly as you're seeing recombinant growth factors, things that are getting people awfully excited,
Yeah.
I am seeing those organizations, which are very slow to change their processes, but are trying to
Yeah.
figure it out. Because, imagine the next hot brand, $100 million revenue, $1 billion acquisition brand starts with, say, epidermal growth factor, some modification thereof, and they want to acquire it.
Yeah.
What they can't. So I am seeing, I have not, I would say the majority of people have moved on from that concern. It
Good.
exists in little pockets, but there are still some big players who are trying to soul searching into how, what do they want their policy to be, considering they're probably going to get left behind.
Yeah.
I think the sentiment is biotech is an inevitability. You're working with your engineering biology to work with your biology. I mean, how can it not be?
When you said that inevitable, I just thought of Thanos with his glove being like, I am inevitable.
Well, kind of the opposite of what I was going for, but
Yeah. So where do you see the most realistic potential for biotech to disrupt beauty, not just in storytelling, but product impact? I think you touched upon maybe the recombinant proteins, but kind of what do you feel deep in your soul is the most
deep
realistic?
In my soul.
Deep in your soul.
Mean, I am a polypeptide junkie at heart. But what I love most about those is less that it's just we often think of structural polypeptides, but the fact that you can mix and max modules. Even before it was realistically capable at scale, and this isn't a new idea. People have been talking about it, but no one's known the product space or what to do with it since early 90s. This idea that you could say, I'm going to take a module from silk that adds strength, a polypeptide sequence, and I'm going to attach it to a growth factor, then I'm also going to attach it to a collagen binding module. And so then you have a film forming, durable, long lasting, growth stimulating molecule all in one. I am beyond excited about that. And now when you look at sort of the generative design, protein design you can do with AI, where you can quite literally take a biological structure, and say, design a protein that binds to this. Then it's going to become a question. It's going to be inevitable where we're just going to start looking at trying to understand skin, hair issues better, so that we can just throw them into the generative design and say, okay, now we know, what functionality we want. AI design something that will cause that functionality. I mean, I'm totally geeking out. I think we still have to the point of what are the risks. I think the opportunities are insane, but the risk, it's like figuring out how to make that cost effective, figuring out how to make it efficacious. AI has its own, if you just look at R&D cost risks, it can give you a million options really easily for low price, but then you got to test those. How much are you going to spend to test those? And then you got to make it cost effective. So we still have a lot of challenges and growth to do as an industry. We are not the petroleum industry where it's just like there's facilities everywhere. It costs nothing as for all practical purposes, but it's happening. I mean, China's invested a lot of money into scaling biotech really quickly. So it's going to be a very interesting competitive landscape over the next even few years, because they've leaned into that heavily. They dominated, hardware manufacturing, and they're going to dominate biomanufacturing soon.
Yeah. So, ending this session, what advice would you give to brands evaluating biotech suppliers or scientists trying to break into beauty?
So for the scientist, I think on day one, learn cosmetic GMP regulations, formulation. There's so much more than just I've made the ingredient. Is it stable? Is it stable in a formulation? Is it easy to formulate?
Compatible.
I see a lot of ingredients die because it's such a cool ingredient, but they never figured out how to make it compatible. And it's not actually a high cost endeavor. Like we were saying earlier, you can work with a formulation lab to at least get an understanding, but get ahead of that. Get ahead of understanding how a formulation works. Just learn the basics of formulation and product stability and product manufacturing so you know what you're trying to build into and you know what you're selling. Because you're probably not selling just your ingredient or not in the form factor you're used to working on it. Maybe it's spray dried. Maybe it's formulated with a stabilizer and a preservative. Just learn those things and then understand the regulatory and safety requests that you're going to get from brands. All of this information is available online, but very simple HRIPT tests and things like that. But then understand your cost basis after that, depending on what you want to build. What do you expect? How do you expect to sell? Tons per year. For brands, I think you really need to shift expectations on pricing. That doesn't mean, you'll pay anything, but understand that if you want a successful multi-year launch, like you can expect costs to go, it's reasonable to expect costs to go down over time. But think about that multi-year plan when you're thinking about it, what you're going to get to, even if you have to pay a little more upfront. And how do you cover that cost? And then further, just reasonable expectations around exclusivity. Every brand loves coming and saying, I want exclusivity and I absolutely need it. I'm the best, going to be the best thing in the world. Well, is that realistic for the other side? And maybe you don't care, but don't be surprised if it's not, if someone's trying to build a biotech business. Or don't be surprised if you choke a biotech business to death because you demanded exclusivity.
I was just going to say, yeah.
I've seen that in apparel. I've seen that in personal care. And it's like, well, then no one wins. You didn't win.
Yeah, exactly.
You
I was just going to say,
win.
if you're demanding exclusivity, but you never allow that company to actually get to a scalable ingredient that your price goes down, then again, nobody wins. So, well, awesome. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me.